Long before coins were minted, before markets took recognizable form, before wealth could be accumulated in the modern sense, human societies were already bound together by debt. The earliest civilizations did not begin with money, they began with obligation. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where agriculture first sustained dense urban life, economic relations emerged not as systems of exchange, but as systems of coordination. Fields were cultivated collectively. Surpluses were stored in central facilities. Labor was organized by institutions that existed long before private enterprise. Value existed, but not as circulating currency. It existed as accounting. Barley and silver served as units of measure. They were standards against which obligations were recorded, long before they became everyday media of exchange. What mattered was not possession, but promise, the assurance that resources advanced today would be returned after the harvest. From the beginning, debt was not peripheral to society. It was structural. Loans in early Mesopotamian societies typically took the form of seed grain or tools advanced to farmers. A household received barley from a central storehouse with the understanding that repayment would occur after the growing season. Interest was added, not through negotiation, but as a fixed expectation. These interest rates remained remarkably consistent across centuries. Grain loans commonly carried an increase of 1/3. Silver loans carried 1/5. Such precision was not accidental. It reflected a system designed for predictability rather than competition. This was not an economy driven by supply and demand. It was an administered system. The purpose of lending was not wealth extraction. It was continuity. Fields had to be planted each year. Labor had to be sustained. The population had to survive long enough to fulfill its obligations. Debt was tolerated only insofar as it served production. Agriculture in the ancient world was precarious. Floods, droughts, pests, and soil exhaustion could erase an entire year's output. Under such conditions, debt could quickly become unbearable. A single failed harvest could push a household into default. Repeated failures could strip families of land, labor, and freedom. This was not a theoretical risk. It was a recurring reality. Early rulers understood that if debt were allowed to accumulate without restraint, society would fracture. Farmers would lose their land. Families would be broken apart. Free citizens would fall into bondage. Military strength would erode. Tax revenues would collapse. Unchecked debt threatened the foundations of the state. For this reason, debt in early civilizations was never treated as a purely private matter. Economic obligations existed within a political framework. Contracts were recognized, but they were not absolute. Authority stood above them, not as arbitrary power, but as the guardian of social balance. When debt reached destabilizing levels, rulers intervened. At critical moments, often at the beginning of a reign, proclamations were issued annulling outstanding personal debts. Land seized under distress was returned. Individuals reduced to bondage were restored to their families. These acts were not framed as forgiveness. They were framed as restoration. The language emphasized renewal, balance, and the return of proper order. The ruler was not breaking the law, he was reasserting it. Debt cancellation was not weakness, it was governance. Modern thinking often treats debt repayment as a moral imperative. Early civilizations viewed it differently. They understood that debt grows mathematically, while productive capacity grows slowly. Left unchecked, obligations would inevitably exceed the ability to repay them. At that point, enforcing contracts would no longer preserve order, it would destroy it. Periodic debt cancellations served as a reset mechanism. They prevented the permanent transfer of land and labor into the hands of creditors. They preserved the class of free citizens upon which the state depended. This was not about equality, it was about survival. The primary lenders in early societies were not private financiers. They were institutions. Temples and palaces functioned as economic centers. They stored grain, organized labor, maintained records, and extended credit. Their lending was embedded in ritual, law, and administrative oversight. These institutions did not pursue profit in the modern sense. Their objective was stability over time, ensuring that production continued and obligations could be met season after season. Private lenders existed, but their activities were constrained. When private debt threatened social stability, the state intervened without hesitation. The economy operated within limits enforced from above. Freedom in early civilizations was conditional, but it mattered profoundly. The distinction between a free citizen and a dependent laborer defined political life. Debt threatened that distinction. A farmer reduced to bondage was not merely an individual failure, it was a systemic loss. That is why debt cancellations focused on restoring personal status. Children taken as debt servants were returned. Families separated by obligation were reunited. Land lost under distress was reclaimed. Debt could burden households temporarily, but it was not allowed to redefine them permanently. For centuries, this model sustained complex societies. Trade expanded, cities grew, armies marched, taxes were collected. Economic inequality existed, but it was periodically reduced before it could become irreversible. The system worked because it accepted a fundamental truth. Debt must serve society. Society must never serve debt. When the political world of the ancient Near East gave way to the city-states of the Mediterranean, the logic of debt changed in a fundamental way. What had once been a managed obligation became a moral test. This shift did not happen overnight. It emerged slowly as societies reorganized around different ideas of property, citizenship, and authority. In this new environment, debt was no longer treated primarily as a threat to social balance. It was increasingly framed as a measure of personal responsibility. The consequences would be profound. The city-states of ancient Greece were not centralized kingdoms. They lacked the strong administrative apparatus that had allowed earlier rulers to override private claims. Power was fragmented. Authority was shared among elites. Law was shaped through debate rather than proclamation. In this environment, the ruler's ability to reset the economic system weakened. There was no single figure who could declare a general restoration. Contracts acquired a new permanence. Private claims gained legal sanctity. Debt began to harden. Greek societies placed extraordinary importance on land ownership. Land defined citizenship, political participation, and military service. But unlike earlier systems, land in Greece was increasingly treated as private property rather than conditional tenure. Once transferred, it rarely returned. Debt accelerated this transformation. Small farmers borrowed to survive bad harvests. When they failed to repay, land passed to creditors permanently. Families remained on the land as tenants or laborers, stripped of political rights. This was not merely economic loss, it was civic erasure. As debt reshaped society, its interpretation shifted. Failure to repay was no longer seen primarily as misfortune. It became evidence of personal weakness. Obligation was moralized. Repayment was associated with honor, default with shame. This moral framing served a purpose. By treating debt as a personal failing, society absolved itself of responsibility for systemic imbalance. The burden shifted from institutions to individuals. Debt ceased to be a public problem. It became a private sin. The consequences were immediate. As land concentrated in fewer hands, inequality intensified. Political participation narrowed, military recruitment weakened, as dispossessed citizens lost both land and incentive to serve. Social unrest grew. City-states oscillated between oligarchy and revolt. Economic polarization fed political instability. Debt was no longer being released. Pressure accumulated. Where earlier societies reset the system, Greek city-states debated it. Debate was slower than crisis. Some communities recognized the danger. Reformers emerged who sought to limit debt bondage, redistribute land, or restore political balance. These efforts were often contested, partial, and temporary. They faced resistance from creditor elites who now wielded significant political influence. Unlike ancient kings, reformers lacked unquestioned authority. Their actions were framed as radical disruptions rather than necessary restorations. Debt relief became controversial. The Greek world never developed a consistent mechanism for resetting debt. Relief, when it occurred, was episodic and politically fraught. It depended on factional struggle rather than institutional norm. As a result, inequality persisted. Debt was no longer a tool to organize production. It was becoming a means of domination. This transformation marked a decisive break from earlier traditions. By the time Mediterranean powers shifted westward, the logic of debt had fundamentally changed. Obligation was no longer temporary. Property was no longer reversible. Authority no longer stood above contracts. The creditor had begun to eclipse the state. This shift would reach its most extreme form in Rome. Rome inherited many ideas from the Greek world, but it applied them with far greater rigidity. Where Greek city-states vacillated, Rome codified. Where debate once existed, law hardened. In Rome, debt did not merely shape society, it defined it. The Roman Republic developed a legal system that elevated private property and contract enforcement above political intervention. This choice would have lasting consequences. Unlike earlier civilizations, Rome never institutionalized regular debt cancellation. There was no accepted mechanism for restoring balance once obligations exceeded capacity. Contracts were binding. Foreclosure was final. Land transfers were irreversible. Debt was treated as a permanent claim. This permanence fundamentally altered social dynamics. Once land passed into the hands of creditors, it did not return. Families displaced by debt did not regain their status. The past could not be erased. Rome had chosen continuity over correction. Roman law was precise, systematic, and deeply protective of property rights. Creditors enjoyed strong legal standing. Debtors faced severe consequences. Failure to repay could result in loss of land, loss of freedom, and lifelong dependency. Unlike earlier systems, the law did not distinguish clearly between subsistence debt and commercial credit. Obligation was obligation. This legal neutrality favored those with resources. Over time, wealth concentrated. Small landholders disappeared. Large estates expanded. Labor shifted from citizen farmers to dependent workers. Debt became a tool of consolidation. Rome's early strength rested on its citizen soldiers, land-owning farmers who supplied both food and military service. Debt undermined this foundation. As farmers lost their land, they lost their eligibility and motivation to serve. Military recruitment suffered. The army increasingly relied on professional soldiers and mercenaries. This shift altered the relationship between the state and its citizens. Military power became detached from civic participation. Rome was not blind to these dangers. Popular movements emerged demanding debt relief and land redistribution. Political leaders attempted reforms. Laws were proposed. Resistance was fierce. Unlike ancient kings, Roman reformers lacked absolute authority. They operated within a system that privileged private claims. Attempts to intervene were framed as attacks on legal order itself. Reform became synonymous with instability. The creditor class defended its position through law, influence, and violence. Debt remained untouched. As land accumulated in fewer hands, economic inequality translated directly into political dominance. Large landowners controlled votes, offices, and courts. Policy reflected their interests. Debt enforcement continued unchecked. Rome's economy grew, but its social base narrowed. The system produced wealth, but not resilience. Rome's refusal to reset debt created a one-way process. Obligations accumulated, land concentrated, dependency expanded. Unlike earlier civilizations, there was no corrective release. Pressure built without relief. This rigidity did not cause immediate collapse. It produced gradual erosion. Social cohesion weakened. Political conflict intensified. Military loyalty shifted from the state to individual commanders. Debt did not merely shape Rome's economy, it reshaped its politics, its army, and its identity. By the late Republic, the ancient balance was irretrievably lost. Debt was permanent. Property was absolute. Authority was constrained by law aligned with wealth. Rome had abandoned the principle that obligations must serve society. Instead, society served obligation. This choice would define its fate. As inequality deepened, Rome did not lack voices calling for change. What it lacked was the power to enforce it. Reformers proposed limits on land ownership, debt relief for citizens, and redistribution of public land. These measures were not radical in historical terms. Earlier civilizations had applied far more sweeping interventions, but Rome's political structure could not sustain them. Power was fragmented. Law favored property. Creditor elites controlled institutions meant to restrain them. Any attempt to intervene was framed not as restoration, but as subversion. Reformers faced exile, assassination, or civil war. Debt remained untouched. Roman law had become self-reinforcing. Because contracts were sacred, they could not be overridden without undermining the legitimacy of the legal system itself. Because property was absolute, redistribution appeared unlawful. Because authority was divided, no single actor could impose a reset. What had once been a tool of governance now constrained governance. The state could no longer correct its own economic trajectory. As citizen farmers disappeared, Rome's political character changed. Participation narrowed, loyalty shifted. The army became professionalized, bound to commanders rather than land. Political power flowed toward those who could finance campaigns and command troops. Debt was not the sole cause of this transformation, but it was a central accelerator. By concentrating land and dependency, it hollowed out the social base of the Republic. Rome continued to expand territorially, even as its internal balance deteriorated. Conquest brought wealth, slaves, and tribute. These inflows masked structural weakness. Large estates flourished. Urban populations grew dependent on distributions rather than production. The system appeared successful until expansion slowed. Without new resources to absorb pressure, internal contradictions intensified. Debt had built a system that required constant external input to survive. The transition to empire did not resolve the debt problem. It managed it temporarily. Centralized authority replaced republican debate. Distributions replaced reform. Military force replaced consensus. But the underlying structure remained. Land remained concentrated. Debt remained enforceable. Dependency deepened. Imperial power postponed collapse by suppressing symptoms rather than correcting causes. By this stage, the ancient logic of balance was fully abandoned. There were no resets, no restorations, no returns. Debt was permanent. Property was inviolable. Authority served wealth rather than containing it. This was not an accident. It was a choice embedded in law morality, and political structure. Rome demonstrated what happens when economic obligations are allowed to outlive social capacity. Inequality becomes entrenched, political conflict becomes chronic. Military power detaches from civic life. The system does not collapse quickly, it erodes slowly. By the time the damage becomes visible, correction is no longer possible. When Rome abandoned the ancient principle of economic reset, it did more than transform its own society. It set a precedent that would shape centuries to come. The world that followed did not inherit the tools that had once contained debt. It inherited the rigidity that replaced them. What disappeared was not merely a policy, it was a way of thinking. As imperial structures weakened, political authority fragmented, central power faded, but the legal logic Rome had established endured. Debt remained enforceable, property remained absolute. Obligations outlived those who created them. Yet the institutions capable of managing imbalance no longer existed. Earlier civilizations had relied on strong central authority to override private claims when necessary. The post-Roman world had neither the authority nor the tradition to do so. Debt survived the empire. Reset did not. Even as cities declined and trade contracted, debt relationships persisted. Landlords continued to extract rents. Creditors continued to enforce claims. Peasants remained bound to land through obligation rather than ownership. What changed was scale, not structure. Debt no longer fueled expansion. It sustained hierarchy. Without periodic restoration, economic relationships hardened into social status. Dependency became hereditary. Obligation became identity. Debt ceased to be a temporary condition. It became a permanent one. The disappearance of resets altered the meaning of freedom. In earlier systems, a household could fall into debt and recover. Status loss was reversible. Citizenship could be restored. In the post-Roman world, this reversibility vanished. Those who lost land rarely regained it. Those who entered dependency remained there. Social mobility narrowed. Legal status followed economic position. Debt now defined class. This was not enforced through dramatic proclamations. It was enforced quietly, through custom, inheritance, and law. As reset mechanisms disappeared, debt became increasingly moralized. Obligation was framed as duty, repayment as virtue, dependency as failure. This moral framing replaced political intervention. If debt reflected character, then imbalance required no correction. Inequality could be justified as the natural outcome of merit and discipline. The logic was circular and powerful. Debt no longer needed to be managed, it needed to be endured. Legal systems preserved Rome's emphasis on contract enforcement, but lacked Rome's administrative capacity. Law protected claims, but offered no remedy when claims became destructive. This asymmetry mattered. When law enforces obligation without preserving capacity, it accelerates concentration. Wealth accumulates upward. Dependency spreads downward. The system does not correct itself, it stratifies. Across generations, the absence of reset reshaped economic imagination. The idea that debts could be erased faded from institutional memory. Restoration became unthinkable. Obligation appeared eternal. This was a profound historical shift. Earlier societies had treated economic balance as a political responsibility. Later societies treated imbalance as fate. Debt had won by becoming invisible. The ancient world did not fear debt because it misunderstood economics. It feared debt because it understood arithmetic. Obligations compound, capacity does not. Reset was not an admission of failure. It was an acknowledgement of reality. When that acknowledgement disappeared, societies lost a critical tool of survival. They retained obligation, but lost correction. They retained enforcement, but lost balance. Once debt becomes permanent, history follows a familiar path. Land concentrates. Labor becomes dependent. Political power aligns with wealth. Military force detaches from citizenship. The system may persist for centuries. It may even appear stable. But stability without correction is illusion. Pressure accumulates quietly, invisibly, until release becomes impossible. By the end of this transformation, debt is no longer a transaction. It is a structure. It organizes society. It defines class. It shapes power. At this stage, debt no longer needs crisis to assert itself. It operates continuously. What was once a tool becomes a framework. The long journey from the ancient Near East to the post-Roman world reveals a stark contrast. Early civilizations built systems that assumed failure and planned for recovery. Later systems built systems that assumed repayment and punished collapse. The difference is not technical, it is philosophical. One treats economy as a human construct. The other treats it as a moral law. The earliest civilizations understood something later societies forgot. When economic rules threaten the survival of society, the rules must change. They did not confuse obligation with justice. They did not mistake enforcement for stability. They knew that balance required intervention. Once reset disappears, debt becomes destiny. Inequality hardens, mobility fades. Conflict becomes structural. The system does not collapse because it fails. It collapses because it succeeds at extracting beyond capacity. The most enduring consequence of Rome's break with ancient practice was not economic. It was psychological. Over time, societies stopped imagining alternatives. What earlier civilizations had treated as a political tool, the deliberate erasure of unsustainable obligations, slowly vanished from collective thought. Debt ceased to be something that could be managed. It became something that had to be endured. Once reset becomes unthinkable, imbalance becomes permanent. This was the true legacy of the post-Roman world. Without reset, debt ceased to belong to individuals alone. It began to shape families, classes, and generations. Landlessness persisted. Dependency became hereditary. Legal status followed economic position with increasing rigidity. The line between economic condition and social identity blurred. Debt was no longer an episode in a life. It became a life. Societies built on permanent obligation can appear stable for long periods. Hierarchy reduces conflict by fixing roles. Dependency suppresses resistance. Concentration simplifies control. But this stability is brittle. Without correction mechanisms, pressure accumulates silently. Small shocks that would once have been absorbed now cause disproportionate damage. Resilience requires flexibility. Debt permanence eliminates it. As reset disappeared, morality filled the void. Obligation was framed as virtue, endurance as discipline, submission as responsibility. This moral framing masked structural imbalance. If debt reflects character, then inequality requires no explanation. If failure is personal, then intervention is unjustified. The system protects itself by redefining its consequences as deserved. What makes this historical arc striking is not its inevitability, but its contrast. Earlier civilizations did not lack sophistication. They lacked illusions. They did not believe that contracts could override arithmetic. They did not assume that markets could self-correct indefinitely. They did not treat economic rules as sacred. They accepted intervention as necessary. Reset was not chaos. It was maintenance. Across centuries, one pattern remains consistent. When debt is reversible, power remains conditional. When debt is permanent, power solidifies. Land follows obligation. Authority follows land. Law follows authority. Debt becomes the architecture of dominance. This history is not preserved in monuments or myths. It survives in administrative choices, legal traditions, and moral assumptions. What changed after Rome was not human nature. It was institutional memory. Societies forgot that balance had once been enforced deliberately. They remembered obligation. They forgot correction. The journey from the first temples to the post-Roman world traces a clear transformation. Debt began as a managed tool within society. It became a moral obligation enforced upon society. Interest began as a fixed parameter. It became a lever of accumulation. Property began as conditional stewardship. It became absolute control. This transformation did not create prosperity for all. It created endurance for some and dependency for many. The ancient world offers no nostalgia, only instruction. It shows that economic systems do not fail because people are flawed. They fail because rules outlive reality. When obligations exceed capacity, enforcement ceases to be order. It becomes extraction. Reset was not forgiveness. It was survival. Subscribe now and stay informed about the latest developments, because history tells us a lot, and I'll show you where to look.